Hi everyone, it's Wednesday Warriors, and it's me, Arielle. And this week I'm going to be talking about coping with large-scale crises. This is week 2 in our 4-week rotation about coping with eating disorders and certain crises. Week, I'm going to be talking about things like natural disasters or other disasters, or perhaps the loss of a loved one, and how to cope with that when you're already dealing with an eating disorder. The kind of crises that I'm going to be talking about today are ones that are very large scale, disasters that shake up a community or a state or a whole country. How people can turn to one another in these situations to gain perspective, get hope, and really just maintain a sense of living fully, even in the face of so much loss. It's very easy to turn such devastation inward, and it serves as a way to isolate yourself, which can be very unhealthy and also just make you feel even more alone than you might already be feeling when something like that happens. How not to invalidate your own experience, because I think something that happens a lot is that when there is a disaster that shakes up thousands of people, or perhaps even millions of people, depending upon what the disaster is, people tend to think, this person has it so much worse than I have it, so therefore I have no right to feel the way I feel. And it's simply not true. Everyone in this world is an individual dealing with individual experiences. They all have different people around them. They all have a different environment. They have different circumstances. They have different skill sets and tools. They have different mentalities and different intellects and different strengths and different gifts. So that's just going to mean that everyone will deal with the same thing in a number of different ways. And it's very important that you don't tell yourself that you don't have a right to feel the way you feel when disaster strikes, because for one person, losing a best friend because the person moves away could be every bit as devastating as someone who just lost their entire family due to a flood. And while we do tend to say that one is more on a large scale than the other, the sense of grief, the sense of loss is all the same because it's very, very real. There are going to be a lot of people, and I'm sure you've met some of them or heard about some of them, who have a tragic loss happen to them. Maybe they have lost everything they own. Maybe their house burned in a fire or something like that. And they still have this wonderful, genuine, positive outlook where they're very saddened. They're going through grief about what they've lost, but they're still able to say, I have it really good and I can enjoy life. Someone can get a bad grade and they can be devastated, and their grief can almost be worse than this person who just lost their entire house. So we just all grieve differently, and we have to respect that. It's really about respect. You have to respect yourself. You have to respect other people. We all come to the table with different perspectives, and it's really something beautiful about this world and not something that is a problem. So then for a person who's struggling with an eating disorder, who's in the stages of recovery, you have to remember not to turn to your eating disorder in times of crisis. You have to remember that your eating disorder will not help you through this. It will only make it worse. And even though you might get small senses of relief or release or a certain sense of comfort or familiarity from your eating disorder or behaviors associated with it, in the long term, it's really going to make your life that much worse, and it's really going to make coping with such a severe loss or a disaster that much harder. So just sort of going with a natural disaster or some kind of a disaster example. Those of us on the East Coast, like me, just survived Hurricane Sandy. And I'm using this as an example because it's just simply the most recent example, and it's something that I have personal experience with. So where I live, we were very affected by the hurricane because there wasn't actually as much flooding as had been anticipated, but there was massive amounts of destruction. And there were fallen trees, there were people killed by falling trees, there were wires, there were people killed by falling wires. People lost power. And people lost power not for a day or 2 days, but for over a week in many circumstances. And when I say people, I'm talking about thousands of people. I'm not talking about 50 people. So everyone was sort of going through this, And even if they didn't lose a loved one or have their house damaged, which I know a few people who had severe damages to their homes, and that means, they have to front money to pay for some of those things, and it really is just something that shakes up their world. So you have people who didn't lose anyone, but they had damages to their home. And then you have people who were lucky enough not to have anyone be hurt and not have any damages done to their home or their possessions, but they lost power for a week. And I want to tell you about these examples because I really want to highlight for you that all of these people have something to deal with in this crisis. So, for example, someone who had their roof fly off of their house, or they had a tree fall onto their house, they're dealing with some pretty heavy things. And they might be able to recognize that they're lucky enough not to have lost a family member, but they still are going through an awful lot. And if they have a job, or if they have a family, or if they, God forbid, have an eating disorder, it can be a lot to take. And those sorts of things take a long time to resolve. Tree cleanup, a house renovation. And their grief isn't sillier than someone who's grieving the loss of a loved one. And I know it's very easy to compare and it's very easy to prioritize. And certainly most people, their hearts are going to go out to someone who's lost someone because a life is definitely more precious than a possession. But it doesn't mean that the person who has lost possessions have no right to grieve. So it's just about everyone having the right to grieve the way they need to. And then along those lines, you'll have the people who lost power for days at a time. They had no heat. They had no way of cooking food, no way to stay warm, no way, to even take a hot shower or flush the toilet after a certain amount of time had passed. And they did not have any damage to their homes, thankfully, and they didn't have any loss of a family member or a friend. But they're still going through a hard time, and while we might not be able to technically classify that as a loss, it can be pretty much of a struggle when someone also has an eating disorder, or they're dealing with trying to do schoolwork or trying to go to work every day, coming home to a dark, cold house. You're cranky when you don't have power. You're cranky when you're dealing with something. And I think most people can recognize that they're grateful that they didn't have greater losses, but it doesn't mean that they're not having a hard time dealing with what did happen to them. It's just about recognizing that. We really want to steer away from saying, my loss is greater than your loss. My life is worse than your life right now. There's no real point to one-upping people. There's no real point to berating yourself because you feel like someone has it so much worse, so you're going to shut off all your emotions and just say, suck it up and deal with it. That's not going to help you. If you need to grieve something, you have every right to do so, and you'll really be healthier for it. And from here I want to talk about the death of a loved one, and this can be a friend, a family member, an acquaintance, anyone that you had a bond with who's no longer with us. It's very difficult to deal with a loss of any kind, and when we're talking about a human life, it's sometimes hard not to feel alone, no matter how many people surround you and support you and tell you that they're there for you and love you, because grief can be very lonely. And I think people often want to have grief take its course as quickly as possible so they can be over it, get that grief part of the process done, but sometimes it takes a while. And essentially, we won't ever stop grieving the people that we have lost. That's not the point. The goal shouldn't be to finally stop grieving a year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. It's to heal. It's to heal from the loss. And you can heal from a loss and still grieve. We may always grieve people that have gone ahead, and that's okay. And that's normal because that means that they were a precious part of our life. What you do want to do is heal. You want to heal from the loss so that you can grieve healthfully and that you can still live your life and that your grief doesn't stop you from living the life that you want for yourself. I was at a hospice memorial service this past weekend, and I saw and heard a lot of really great things. But one of the things that really stuck with me was a particular reading that someone did for this memorial service. And I just want to read you the last portion of what was a poem called New Life, and the author is unknown. And there are 6 stanzas. And the last stanza of the poem says, "If I should find in time that my thoughts of you no longer render a gaping well of sorrow, I will know your unseen hand has guided me to this place of comfort, and I will go on." And I just thought that that was very special, because what it's doing is it's letting the grieving person know that when they do reach that stage of being okay enough to go on, perhaps it's the person who has died who has comforted them and helped them get to that place. Because I think what happens far too often is that people are afraid to stop grieving because they feel as though they're doing a disservice to the person who has died, or they feel that they're being disloyal or they're betraying that person. I also think that people worry that they have grieved too quickly, and how can they possibly be over it already? How can they possibly be living their life and laughing and being happy again about something? And it makes them worry that somehow the person they were grieving will feel that they don't care enough, or that they've moved on too quickly. So that's the reason why I like the last stanza of the poem, because it's letting the person who's grieving know that when their thoughts no longer render a gaping well of sorrow, that's okay, and know that the person they have lost has actually guided them to that place of comfort and is happy that they're finally okay enough to go on. And that's what's supposed to happen. That's how you still grieve, but you heal at the same time, because grief doesn't always and should not always be that gaping well of sorrow. But often it's important to go through that very, very difficult time of deep sorrow, because if you try to push it away or you try to get over it, you're doing a disservice to yourself. You have every right to go through the process, and no one, not even yourself, should take that from you. Support in these kinds of times is huge. Support about the loss of someone, support about a natural disaster. However, wherever you feel you are on that plane of grief, if there are tons of people that have it worse than you, tons of people that have it better than you, whatever the situation, it's important to reach out for support. Or if you're not actually asking for certain kinds of support, just to surround yourself with the people that make you feel good and comforted. And even if you can't feel happy, at least you can feel comfortable with someone else who is there for you. And to keep that eating disorder at bay, you just want to employ all the same things that you would do whenever you're having a hard time. Things like leaving your house when you need a distraction or you need to get away from feeling an urge. Things like doing creative art projects or writing projects or journaling. Taking a walk outside, listening to music that makes you feel upbeat rather than keeps you centered in that kind of grief and pain. And really, we can learn from each other. So if you happen to know someone who suffered a kind of loss, maybe you can go to that person and not even say, "What have you done to help yourself get through this?" You can ask that question, but maybe just being with that person, maybe learning from the way that person operates, and sort of just staying close to keep that hope continually renewing. But the number one thing that I want to tell you is that you don't have to be afraid of grief. Grief can be very scary, but it's real and it's healthy, and if you let yourself feel it, you will get better, it will pass, and you will go on. Make sure you turn to the right things and the right people, and not to your eating disorder. There's a beautiful sense of closeness and union that can come from a crisis. When other people are affected in a similar way, then you have the ability to look around and see that it's not just you struggling, it's not just you hurting. And when people come together, the sense of closeness and unity and that universal sort of hope and spirit can oftentimes be enough to lift people out of the heaviest kind of grief. So don't underestimate it. I hope you all have a wonderful week out there, and I will see you next time.